Good. Okay. Well, I think now we can get going, and I will. I'll try and be as interesting as possible, and not too. As I said, so last time on the last video, which, as I say, I don't think anyone has actually had a chance to look at, but the last time we were together, taking a little bit longer looking at the places that are involved in the last week of Jesus' life when we do the manual with the living the last week. So what I wanted to do this time was to look at look very specifically about some of the people. Now, obviously, anyone who's done the walkthrough with me, we've got 70 plus characters, so haven't got time to do all of them. There you go, we've got my nice little graphics there. So what I wanted to look at was very specifically about the kind of the group that are there at the cross. And actually on the presentation slide, I noticed it's probably reshaped it slightly. That little bit at the bottom says the myrrh bearers, which is actually a kind of a title that is used particularly in the Orthodox Church, where it has a very kind of specific group of 10 people that they kind of list in that. In kind of Catholic tradition, in Catholic tradition, they kind of also use the phrase the myrrh bearers, but it kind of varies from 2 people upwards. But fundamentally, it's to do with, if you like, those individuals who are very active and involved in both the witness of the cross and the preparation of the body and the witness of the resurrection. And so obviously there's the kind of the core group of the women and their families, and then there's a couple of extras like Nicodemus and Clopas, and Joseph of Arimathea and so on. And it just is, as I say, when we do these sessions, what I wanted to do is kind of get a little bit behind the scenes, because these aren't necessarily bits that I do when I do this as a kind of a live event. Because there's a lot of thinking about these kind of characters that kind of go into kind of shaping the story. But when you're trying to tell a story, you need to kind of ignore that. You need to let it shape it, but you don't want to kind of get totally bogged down in the detail and kind of going back over it and so on. So very often I kind of will present things and I'll say, well, there's another possibility here or so on. What we do tonight is we'll just have a little bit of a wider look and understand some of these kind of characters. So kind of core, right at the heart, is the women. And what I should really say, I suppose, is it's interesting that there's a kind of even a title, the myrrh bearers for this group. And it kind of highlights very kind of, in terms of the storytelling, the fact that the disciples of Jesus are not there. It's one of those things that just even mentally in my mind, sometimes I juggle and I think, well, it never says that they're there in the Gospels, but we do this kind of principle where you say, just because someone's not mentioned doesn't mean they're not there. Perhaps they're from a distance. Perhaps perhaps Peter is somewhere away in the distance. And I entertain all of those thoughts. But it's kind of, you would imagine in terms of the way in which actually all 4 of the Gospels, well, 3 out of the 4 at least, are very kind of consciously, so I'm excluding Mark, but Matthew, Luke and John are very consciously written according to kind of conventions of ancient biography with kind of a reference towards the eyewitnesses in mind. And so if Peter had been there, for instance, it's difficult to imagine that he would have been totally ignored. So if Peter had been there, they might have ignored, for instance, Bartholomew, or they might have ignored James the Less or something. But the fact that really we're aware of John, although he disappears, and we've got this kind of core group who are right at the heart and of the kind of the witness of the resurrection and the experience of the cross and so on. That in itself tells us something kind of in the storytelling. It kind of tells us and highlights and kind of counterparts the absence of the other disciples. And it's interesting that in terms of the early church and the writings of the early church, the myrrh bearers actually they take up a lot of people's thinking, because I think the significance of them was not lost on the early church. They were very kind of, and so therefore what we find actually, and I'm going to start with the women at the cross, which was such a kind of key part, and we often flag when I'm doing the presentation the place of Salome. But actually, in early Christian writing, she is a very significant character. So I've got on the slide, she's a significant figure. She's listed by the Greek philosopher Celsus If you know the name Celsus, it might be because you've heard that Origen wrote a book called Contra Celsus, which is against Celsus. So Celsus was a kind of critic of the church. He was a Greek speaker. I think he was probably Greek, but he was in Rome, and he encountered a kind of a wide variety of the growing Christian church in Rome in the 2nd century. So only about 140, 150 AD. So not a million, not a million years away from the events of the cross. And as he kind of complained in his writings about the church, we kind of got this little statement. He said, I could mention those who call themselves, so he's been listing through different sects. I could mention those who call themselves Smithsonians, after Simon, or something, Smithsonians. Thinking of the Smithsonian Museum, the Simonians, after Simon. I'll come back to him in a second. And those naming themselves Hellenians after Helen, his consort. Okay, that's interesting. Just park that for a second. And there are Christian sects named after Marcellina, and it says Harper-Creation Christians. So that tells us something. It's his word for what we would think of as Gnostic Christians. So Marcellino is a kind of a Gnostic sect who trace themselves to Salome. So first of all, we actually know a fair bit about Marcellina because she's written about by the early church as well. She's a female church leader in Rome, who is heavily influenced by a guy who then gets associated. This guy, he's not actually said the same way. I can't remember what his name is now, but who's kind of become part of this Gnostic sect. So in that sense, they're not a group that we might think of as an Orthodox Christian group, but from this kind of critic's point of view, they are part of the colours and the streams of Christianity. And very specifically, he highlights they trace themselves back to Salome. Which makes sense because Marcellina herself is a female church leader, and she kind of roots herself back. And as we can see, because Salome is seen as a very significant church leader by the early Christian writers. And she's of course a key witness of the crucifixion. So, and some of those follow Mariamne. Now that Mariamne, that derivative spelling means Mary Magdalene. The way the name slightly gets changed and has the amne bit is kind of it's to do with copy errors at some point, but we understand it means Mary Magdalene. So there are those who follow Mary Magdalene, there are those who follow Salome, and others who follow Martha. Well, that's interesting as well, isn't it? So you see, so we've got three significant figures that he's recognizing within the spread of the church in Rome have kind of, if you like, denominations named after them, or denominations that root themselves back. So, like the Methodists would say we root back to John Wesley. It doesn't mean that he's the only thing. It doesn't mean that John would necessarily approve of everything that's going on in the Methodist Church. It just means that they root themselves back and kind of take inspiration from him. And still others call themselves Marcionites. Some of you will be aware of that, of Marcion. Marcion again is picked out as being a heretic by, I think it's Irenaeus who picks up on him. Because he doesn't want to follow the Old Testament. He sees the God of the Old Testament as being different from the gospel that he sees presented by Paul. So he proposes that we only have 11 letters from Paul and a kind of a cut down version of Luke, and that should be the scriptures, you see. So he gets kind of treated in those ways. So this is Origen who's reporting this, but he's kind of telling us what Celsus has written. So in this mix, you kind of, first of all, I just wanted to kind of highlight, we've got this three of the women who are witnesses, and we'll touch on Martha because we often don't present her as a witness, but we'll look at the traditions as to whether Martha is a witness to the crucifixion and the resurrection as well tonight. But we've got three women who are kind of part of this kind of core group, who are then seen as being kind of, if you like, significant, almost denominational heads or stream heads that has already hit the church in Rome. And when something is written by a critic, it gets taken very seriously by historians. Obviously, if you're writing as a proponent, you might be a bit propagandist, but if you're critiquing, what you're saying is probably generally true. So anyway, just before we leave this slide, because it highlights a couple of the things, and in many ways what I'm doing here is it gives me an opportunity just to talk to stuff and introduce ideas, because he talks about the Simonians after Simon, but he's not talking about Simon Peter, because the Simonians were another Gnostic sect who traced themselves back to Simon Magus. So we've got an interesting situation because he's grouping them all as Christian. Although some of the Christians are arguing and saying, well, these people should be in, those aren't, those are Gnostic, those are Marcionites. So the Marcionites are a different type of heretic, but he's just seeing it all as Christian. And I think it's interesting, this is a slight kind of comment even into the kind of current context. I was just watching an episode of Pointless the other day, and I think they made reference to a Kingdom Hall, and what the answer to a question, was it on that or some other quiz, was a Kingdom Hall, and they said, oh, Jehovah's Witness is a Christian denomination. I thought, well, I might think, well, they don't have a Trinitarian theology, therefore are they Christian? But in terms of the way the world experiences, what they see is, well, these people are self-identify as following Jesus, and they call themselves Christians, so we will see them and understand them that way. And as much as I might like to feel that I should be the arbiter of everything that bears the name Christian, the fact is I'm not, and so I have to kind of live with that context and understand, if you like, and hold in humility that I believe the things I believe, not because I'm 100% convinced I'm right about everything, but because it seems to be the best solution, and therefore, and I find that a kind of a Trinitarian theology is my best solution, if you like. But to understand that there may be others who are in their way trying to follow, and somehow we are kind of grouped together by those who look in on the outside of us. So it's a slight side issue, but I just thought it's interesting to see, even in Rome, right in the early days, 2nd century, this is 2nd century BC, 2nd century AD, a whole bunch of people have all been grouped together as being Christ followers, but from the inside they're looking around saying, well, you're in, you're out, and so on. But they all kind of mix together. So although the group here that roots itself back to Salome is probably seen as kind of sub-Christian or kind of, well, the problem with Gnosticism was it was so super spiritual, it didn't understand, if you like, the miracle of normal creation. The flesh was just something evil and corrupt and broken and so on. But the fact that it's kind of gone that way, we shouldn't miss the fact that they see Salome as such a kind of key way. So there's several other kind of references to Salome, though, in the early church writings, just worth kind of drawing them out. The Nag Hammadi Gospel of Thomas, as it's referred to, there are various documents that are attributed to Thomas in different ways, which is why I've kind of the Nag Hammadi one is a collection that's actually was found as about the middle of the last century at a place called Nag Hammadi, which is why you kind of qualify it with that. And it was a collection of sayings, 14 sayings or teachings of Jesus. So it doesn't have any sense of narrative to the gospel. It's just kind of, if you like, teaching sayings. And an early commentator on it, again, referred to the Nag Hammadi gospel as being a Gnostic gospel. But it has been, since then, people have looked at it and said, well, why did he call it a Gnostic gospel? And the only reason that because the reason why he called it a Gnostic gospel was because Jesus answers some questions a bit cryptically, but it's been pointed out that actually there are answers like that in the regular Gospels anyway. So we have this collection of 14 kind of bits of teaching. Quite a lot of them we find exact parallels in the existing Gospels. And so then other scholars say, well, perhaps this is a bit like the Q document that we've all been looking for, the collection of sayings of Jesus. And so the kind of the summation of all that is, I think, a reasonable approach is that it captures, it may not be canon in the sense of that we would treat it with the kind of same authority as the Gospel of Mark or whatever, but it is a very useful and illuminating kind of text in terms of kind of giving you slight nuanced extra sights of Jesus and so on. And what's interesting in the Gospel of Thomas is he calls Salome and Mary, which we presume is Magdalene because he doesn't qualify, he just refers to her as Mary. He refers to them as disciples, so he gives them that title. Which is kind of really, again, it's interesting. It fits with the gospel narrative in that we find Mary, if Mary Magdalene is the same as Mary of Bethany, which I've made that kind of assumption, or I've come to that conclusion, not as a hard, fast fact, but as a good working hypothesis. If that Mary is the one we're talking about here, and we do have that story where she is seated at Jesus' feet, she's sitting in the place of discipleship. And so there is that sense in which Luke's gospel also endorses at least one of these two characters with that idea that she's a disciple. And here in the the Nag Hammadi Gospel of Thomas, we have these two characters, Salome and Mary, who are both referred to and called disciples. But it's not the only place Salome is grouped as one of the disciples. And just to kind of fiddle these bits together, remember what I'm doing tonight is not trying to teach, if you like, this is the truth. It's to give you guys, it's to give some of the background thinking and ideas just to mull around with, play around in your own heads, and sort of juggle with. Is that in that passage in Luke, shortly after introducing Mary as being a disciple or possessing her as that way, Jesus tells three parables about lostness. You know, the famous one is the prodigal son, or the lost son. So we call it the parable of the lost son. Then there's the parable of the lost sheep, and then the final one, the parable of the lost coin, which is really interesting because if that parable presupposes that Jesus now has women sitting in discipleship roles, because it's a parable that only really makes sense where there's very kind of clear gender roles in a culture like in Judaism. It's a story that is kind of relevant and makes sense emotionally to the women involved rather than the men. So you have this sort of hints in Luke's gospel in particular of these women in the discipleship group, as he introduces to the women from Galilee that support. He doesn't use the word disciple, but he presents Jesus endorsing Mary in the discipleship role and using parables that very specifically relate to women if they're sitting listening and learning as disciples and so on. And so it kind of fits. So that's kind of a very long-winded way for for a two-line sentence. The Nag Hammadi Gospel of Thomas kind of, that it doesn't tell us anything shocking or surprising. There's no kind of, it doesn't radically change our view of Jesus, but it has some interesting little extra bits, and one of them being that Salome is a disciple. And there's also a slightly more complex, if I put it that way, early writing. It's called the Greek Gospel of the Egyptians, which belongs to the early century. Unfortunately, we don't have we only have it in fragments that are recorded for us and rewritten for us in various other writers. But actually, what we do know about the Greek Gospel of the Egyptians, so early 2nd century, is about 120 AD is when it's normally thought to have been written, is that the whole gospel is presented as a dialogue between Salome, who is presented as a disciple, and Jesus. And quite a lot of it is dealing with, and it's kind of verging towards the aesthetic. It's not totally Gnostic, but it's to do with kind of sexual ethics and so on. And so that's why perhaps it's got kind of conversation between a woman and a man, and the kind of the responses and so on. And it takes a strong line which kind of would advocate kind of celibacy for everybody and so on. And it's not the gospel, but again, what you find is the assumption that Salome has been drawn out, if the gospel has been written around her, as a kind of as a big figure. That can, if you like, ask the female questions of Jesus, and ask those kind of questions as a woman of Jesus. And so she's presented in those ways. So you're kind of getting a little bit of a picture. I haven't drawn out everything because there's quite a few mini kind of throwaway lines and so on, references to Salome in this kind of discipleship role. There's also a more controversial document. I've got a photo of it just to the side here. I say it's controversial. It depends what you mean by controversial. What's controversial is it was uncovered in about 1958, I think it was, and it was photographed, and facsimiles of it were kind of produced, and then it got lost. So it's difficult to kind of test, if you like, its authenticity now, in terms of being able to test the papyrus. You can only work on it according to the grammar and the language and style of writing and so on that you can get from the facsimiles. But it also, it is, again, when I say it's controversial, it's only controversial in that it's sometimes referred to as being the secret gospel of Mark, and some people kind of give it a kind of a veneer of this is the real truth, if you know, and so on. But again, it's not actually that radical in anything it says. I've given you the little bit where it tells us something extra about Salome. I've kind of reproduced in full. Because it's what they refer to in the Gospels is sometimes you get a little moment which produces what they call a lacuna, which is that in the flow of the narrative there's clearly a piece missing, that doesn't mean there's a piece being cut out of the gospel. It just means that the teller has told us one bit and then he's jumped to another bit and he's missed something out in between. And it kind of fills one of those, what they call the lacuna in Mark's gospel. So in Mark's gospel, we would read in the white text, they came to Jericho, and as he went out from Jericho. So Jesus has arrived in Jericho, and it feels like therefore it's supposed to be something that happens in Jericho, but then he's immediately going out. So there's a kind of little piece there. And in the Marsaba letter, we get this little extra phase. And the sister of the young man whom Jesus loved was there with his mother and Salome, but Jesus would not receive them. So all sorts of questions it raises, in this. First of all, is his mother, is the mother here Jesus' mother, or is it the young man's mother? I think it's probably the young man's mother. So, but what we have is we have a young man whom Jesus loved. Well, it sounds a bit like the disciple who Jesus loved, or the beloved disciple that is presented in John's gospel, doesn't it? If you stop and think of it like that. So you've got this character, and it's making a reference to his mother. And if you've done the walkthrough with me, if we take the view that that the author of John's gospel is John the Apostle, and the mother of John the Apostle, as we're going to see in a minute, is almost certainly Salome, then this was a slight contradiction there, you see, because here the mother of John is with Salome, so it looked like Salome was a friend of the mother of John rather than the mother of John. But I'm putting it here, as I say, because this is kind of this isn't necessarily stuff that I would teach on the on the day as we run through. It's just all part of the background. This is quite nice to have an opportunity to kind of just share some of the kind of the thinking and how you shape these things together. And it kind of highlights, I suppose, the approach that I try and take, which is with the early churches. I want to produce a version of this story that takes the testimony of the early church seriously as testimony, which means that there might be times when they get a bit confused, and there may even be times where someone does something a bit deliberately bad. But the kind of current approach is because there's some contradictions and bits that don't quite match and make sense, we abandon everything as if everything is a total fantasy, which isn't actually true of kind of the human psyche. Even people who are totally dishonest tend to build using truth. It's just the way the human brain works. It's far more effort to totally fantasize everything. So what you tend to do is, even if you were trying to kind of prove a point surreptitiously, you would probably still build on basic facts. And so you can use the testimonies of the early church and documents like this, and we try and blend them together. So what we're getting here is another kind of reference to her, Salome, in the process and in the flow of the action of Jesus, and this meeting where in Jericho, of course, is in the last phase. It's with the sending out of the 72 is dominating this period, so probably it's in the process where the 72 have been going out. And in that kind of context, therefore, it's not surprising that we meet a disciple who Jesus loved, or the young man who Jesus loved. There is a tradition that John, the beloved disciple, isn't John the Apostle, but he was a member of the 72, so perhaps it's in this kind of context. For some reason, as I say, Jesus doesn't receive them, but it kind of just it highlights again her involvement and the fact that she gets specifically mentioned in this other kind of document. And so when we do the actual walkthrough, I often kind of flag, and for the ease sake, and I will often say, I kind of balance between two opinions when it comes to John, the author of the Gospel, and his relationship to Salome, because they're very tied together. But the easy solution with Salome, when we look at the three kind of Gospel accounts of who's at the cross, is to see that Salome is Jesus' aunt, i.e. his mother's sister, and she's also the mother of James and John. And you get that from the comparison of the kind of different Gospel lists. So Mark, who tells us that Mary Magdalene, so these are the women at the cross. There's Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James and Joseph, and Salome. Matthew tells us that there's Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James and Joseph, and the mother of the sons of Zebedee. So if you kind of say, oh well, Salome is replaced here by the mother of the sons of Zebedee, they could be two people, but perhaps they're one person. So first thing we'd say is, therefore Salome looks like she's the mother of James and John, who are the sons of Zebedee, and she would therefore be the wife of Zebedee. John's Gospel then says Mary Magdalene, Mary the wife of Clopas, his mother's sister, and we put a comma in there, but of course Greek doesn't have a comma, so it is possible that John. So you see, if you take it with the comma, it would imply that Salome, who's the mother of James and John, who's married to Zebedee, is also Jesus' mother's sister, i.e. she is Jesus' aunt. And that is, I would say at this point, there is absolutely nothing wrong with that as a working proposition. It's one I use all the time. But what I'm getting across tonight is the other possibilities, but to kind of hold them in these different ways, so you kind of get a feel. Because the other possibility, which I then sometimes do flag, because it's one where I waver, depending on the day of the week, which one, because certain ways it's very nice and easy and tight to say, so Salome, the mother of James and John, and Jesus' mother's sister are all the same person. But it's been pointed out that actually John without the comma would read Mary Magdalene, Mary the wife of Clopas, and I've put in who is, as in third words, who is his mother's sister. and the reason why some people would want to read it that way, just so we're aware, is because we have strong testimony to that in the writings of the early church. So we have a very early record of the fact that Mary the wife of Clopas is Jesus' mother, is Jesus' mother's sister-in-law, but the sister-in-law is a concept is almost never kind of spelt out in the ancient world. She's just the sister. So Mary is married to Clopas, who they universally, we have very ancient traditions saying from people like Hegipus and Papias that Clopas is the brother, or Cleopas, which is probably all variants of the name Halphi. That there's a strong testimony that he is Joseph's brother, so Jesus' uncle. Therefore, his wife Mary is Mary, the mother of Jesus' sister-in-law. But they don't use the word sister-in-law; they would just call her sister. So you've got these two options. Is the sister the same person as Mary of Clopas, or is it somebody different? If it's someone different, then is it Salome, the mother of the sons of Zebedee? So being very confusing, but hopefully it's kind of sort of holding together. Let me just go back. So the most kind of consistent sort of tradition about Salome, if we kind of look at all the kind of documents that you have, there is a kind of a strong, although you can argue it, and some modern commentators do, that everybody should be totally different. So Salome is different from the mother of the sons of Zebedee, who's different from his mother's sister, who's different from Mrs. Clopas, etc., etc. And the kind of long tradition and consistent tradition does make Salome the mother of the apostles James and John. So that bit has kind of nicely tied up, with the exception of the if we then match that and say with the Mar Saba letter, that the question mark that would then raise is that if John the Apostle is the son of Salome, and Salome comes with the mother of another John, or the beloved disciple, then actually that would kind of make sense of the idea that John's Gospel is written by John the disciple, effectively, who is one of the 72 rather than John the Apostle. Bit confusing, isn't it? Sorry, I hope you're following that. If you kind of match the two together. So, but very clearly that I think, and therefore the position I would take is almost certainly we should understand, said with qualification when I say almost certainly, that to me, from a narrative point of view and with looking up all the evidence, it looks very strongly that we should recognise Salome as the mother of James and John the Apostles. And the thing to notice is, although we can say, well, is she the aunt or whatever, almost all of the ancient traditions show her in some way as a relative of Mary, the mother of Jesus. It's just that they have slight nuances. So, for instance, some of them, as I say, see her as Jesus' aunt, as we've already seen, so i.e. Mary's sister, biological sister, Jesus' aunt. Some of them actually, this is the Orthodox tradition here, so the Orthodox Church sees Salome as actually one of the unnamed sisters of Jesus from the we read about in the Gospels. So we've got 4 brothers, and then there are two unnamed sisters. And obviously you then got positions where people say, are they the sons of Joseph from a previous marriage, or were they born to Mary separately, and so on. And that's irrelevant. The key thing here, in one sense, is that they see Salome as being a sister of Jesus, so another relative. Which would, again, therefore it comes actually in terms of activity and actions that Salome takes, it comes very close to whether she's the aunt, because as often when I do the presentations, we kind of highlight, she seems to disappear probably from the resurrection narrative as Mary disappears. Well, that makes sense if she's a relative, even if it's the aunt or the daughter. And then the final one is there's also a tradition that she is actually Mary Clopas' daughter, and therefore, of course, she'll be Jesus's cousin. So you got those kind of 3 ideas which you can find ancient writers in some way or other alluding to or touching on. Which kind of gives a position where we see in some way or other what we can kind of perhaps draw out is that this character Salome, who's quite a key figure in the crucifixion, the resurrection narratives, and in the spread of the early church, actually is a relative. So we can say that. As I say, for simplicity's sake, as I will often highlight and draw out, that actually it makes total sense if she is the aunt. Things work very well if she is, but it's just to be aware there could be other possibilities, but that other possibilities are not a million miles away from that position of her being the aunt. Hopefully that will make sense. One of the things I thought was interesting, I only saw recently, was there was a kind of a program on TV about the women in the early church that was done by, there's quite a strong work that's done by a more kind of radically sort of feminist approach, which means sometimes I feel that ideologically they're a bit blind to certain things, but actually in many ways they're highlighting things that I was grown up having pointed out to me, which was the significance of women in the early church phases. But one of the things that came out on that program, which I didn't know, was that the oldest Christian grotto in the land of Israel, current land of Israel, is actually has inscription that dedicates it to Holy Salome. So she is actually kind of, if you like, and a grotto, of course, is before a big church building, but it was a place, is a little cave area. It was kind of it looks like it was a converted tomb that has been converted for people to come in and pray and so on. And there's prayers and imprecations kind of written on the walls, but across the door the place is dedicated to her. So at the heart of these women, the myrrh bearers, who are so key to the testimony that we have, they fill in the details you see of the Gospels, is this character who looks very strongly like she is a very, very really and very genuinely is a member of Jesus' close family, possibly an aunt, possibly a sister, possibly a cousin, but she seems to be right in there. She's also therefore very strongly the mother of 2 of the apostles, and so on, and she has a significant kind of influence on the church. So she's just not an invisible, unknown character, but just one that if we've not kind of looked around the outside, we probably haven't seen how her role works in those ways before. So we'll keep moving, because we've only done one character so far, but I did have most of my material actually on Salome, so most of the others we do a bit quicker. Because it kind of then contrasts this place with the role of Mrs. Clopas, or Mary, the other Mary, as she's sometimes called, who the early church is very key and very clear on that actually the 2 of them, they are Jesus' relatives again. And this kind of picture that we're seeing is the closeness of the family, as we're going to see as we kind of goes right the way through, that actually the closeness of family is quite important to the early church. It doesn't come through sometimes in the gospel narratives, particularly, and then of course the book of Acts really covers the spreading into the Gentile world, which therefore misses what goes on in Jerusalem. But the Jerusalem church, Jesus' family, we find in the early church writings quite a lot. But anyway, as I said, when it comes to the Clopases, the church is consistent in its view that Cleopas or Clopas was Joseph's, i.e. Jesus' father's brother. So I've got the references there, Hegipus and Papias, in the 2nd century. We get both of them are reported by other writers, but they're kind of quoted extensively, so we kind of pick them up that way. So here's the kind of quote from Papias. So Mary, the wife of Cleopas or Alphaeus, you see, so we will often, when I do this presentation, I point out that Clopas' name, sometimes he's called Cleopas, sometimes he's called Alphaeus in the Gospels, and actually Papias recognises this is a bit confusing, so he kind of, Cleopas is actually the same person as Alphaeus. He was the mother of the James the bishop. I put a little question mark over that, because this is one of those areas where we're not quite sure why he said that, because normally we would think of James the bishop as being Jesus' actual brother, whereas this, of course, if Mary married to Cleopas is the mother of James the bishop, then she is not Jesus' brother, it's Jesus' cousin. And then some people will say, well, the problem is that sometimes cousins are called brothers, you see, so it gets that's why it gets kind of complicated. So I put that kind of little question mark, because I would tend to see them as different people, but just highlighting it. And so she calls him the bishop and the apostle, so she makes that actually James the Less, who is the apostle, who is therefore the son of Mrs. Clopas, in Papias is saying as actually the same person as James the bishop, who we tend to think of as being the brother of Jesus, but in which case, if he is correct, if we put all those things together, the word brother is being used broadly for the word cousin. But that it doesn't quite fit to me quite as well in terms of the narrative that Paul gives of Jesus appearing to James and making a distinction of James and the other apostles. It's kind of that James, kind of his apostleship, which comes out of his proximity as the brother of Jesus, seems to kind of be of a different nature. So it seems this has been one of those areas where you think, okay, maybe he just kind of, Eusebius, as he's writing it, maybe he's added that comment, and Papias actually didn't say that. Maybe he's the one that said bishop and apostle, and maybe he's just got a bit confused. Now that's fine to say that, because we're not throwing the whole thing away. We're just saying, oh, it's a bit of an odd statement. We have to deal with it. And Simon and Thaddeus, and of one Joseph, and that matches very closely again, with the what we know from elsewhere. So we're also told, I think it's by Eusebius again, but maybe from the same source, I'm not sure, that Mr. Clopas is with his companion on the road to Emmaus, and actually one of those that companion is actually his son Simon. Remember, the angels have said to go and tell his brothers, so maybe you see they're on the road to Emmaus because they're actually trying to fulfill that. Maybe some of Jesus' extended family have already, because of the heart-wrenching thing of discovering that Jesus has been executed and crucified, they head straight back home towards Nazareth, but instead of going the pilgrim route with all the people who are full of joy because they're very low, they kind of take off for the direct route, which would take them through Emmaus. So Clopas and Simon, who are Jesus' uncle and cousin without a doubt in my mind, take off on the road that takes them up to Emmaus, which would take them through Samaria and straight to Nazareth. It's the kind of direct route, the quickest way. So I suspect that they've done that because that's the route that the family would be taking, and they need to go and pass on the news that the women have now heard from the angel. A few hours later, of course, they'll have even more news, but they won't be going in the direction of Emmaus. They'll be heading back to Jerusalem because they're going to meet Jesus for themselves. But so as a kind of a key pair and a kind of couple, they're really key to the resurrection events as individuals, and they kind of become parents of the first church, producing I think actually two of the bishops of Jerusalem, Simon being the one after James. I think one of their other sons as well is I think it's the youngest Joseph as well, also is traditionally becomes one of the bishops in Jerusalem. And I think it's Simon, sorry, I'm doing this from memory now, it's Simon who is there when the Romans come, and actually who leads the church away from Jerusalem before the Romans attack. So they, in that sense, as characters and as figures, they're both close to Jesus familiarly, but they become very significant in the shape and actually the survival of the Christian church around Jerusalem. So after Jerusalem is first sacked by the Romans, they actually kind of come back into that space, the Christian church does. So anyway, taking far too long, I'm sure. So we've done kind of we've done Salome and we've done Mary. Another kind of, obviously, Mary of Bethany stroke Mary Magdalene, because I see them as the same person. I've added Lazarus. He's of course technically not a myrrh bearer, a myrrh bearer. He's not involved in one sense, but he is part of that family. So I've kind of included him in this slide because actually the traditions about them all kind of fit together. But I'm going to start with Martha because obviously Mary is the better known very often, and Martha. I will often kind of flag. I kind of was looking back at some of my really old presentations. I will often flag that there's a reference. If you add up the references, there's clearly an unnamed, at least one unnamed woman in terms of the references to the women who followed from Galilee. There's a minimum of one, probably two. Sorry, no, I think it may be that there is two, because it's in the plural. There are at least two unnamed women, and Susanna is probably one, and I normally make a big thing of that. But Martha is possibly the other. The only thing that would go against that is that obviously we meet Martha around Bethany. Normally that, as I say, that group is referred to as the women who followed from Galilee. But actually the traditions around Martha would kind of cover that. So it's quite possible that Martha is, and she's understood that way by the Orthodox Church. The Orthodox Church believes she was there with Mary, and therefore she's considered a myrrh bearer. But we don't read about her. But as we touched on when we analyze these things, the fact that someone is omitted in terms of direct reference doesn't mean that they might not be there. It's just they're not one of the key kind of names that does the leading and so on. But Martha itself actually means the mistress, which definitely tells us straight away she's the oldest daughter, and maybe she's therefore the oldest child. She certainly behaves much more like the family head than Lazarus does. So when Jesus turns up with his disciples in Bethany, she's the one that receives them and kind of hosts them, and of course, which leads to the kind of little conflict with Mary because she's not doing anything and Martha is busy kind of hosting and so on. So she's kind of seen. So her name would imply she's got some standing and some stature, and she knows how to kind of communicate and take a lead within her own township and so on. According to Catholic tradition, Jesus has actually healed her of 7-year flow of blood, which isn't unreasonable. We meet Mary for the first time on a day probably around Bethany where it says Jesus has been healing many who were sick and were demonized. And we do then read of Mary that Jesus has delivered her from 7 demons. And as I say, if you've followed the things I've done in the past on these, you'll notice that I kind of do locate that incident as being close to Jerusalem because of the date, which is between Passover and Pentecost. So that makes it sense that it's there near Bethany, that they're there in that kind of region. So perhaps both of them have been touched, if you like, by the power of Jesus. But then the question is, well, how come they're thought of as being from Galilee? You see, but I think the Catholic tradition tells us that they're a wealthy family, and that they own property both in Judea and in Galilee. So it's not at all unfeasible that Martha is one of those. And she kind of has that role. And if you remember, if we go back to that quote from Celsus, who is a critic of the church, he refers to a sect that traces itself back to Martha. So Mary Magdalene we will understand, but actually there's a sect that traces itself back to Martha, and you can start to see why. Actually, these kind of key figures who are the core witnesses of both the crucifixion and the resurrection kind of have that sort of a status that people would want to trace themselves back to them in different ways. And so it's difficult to explain that if we don't see the kind of the role of the significance of them in these sorts of things. So that you add those bits together, and it's very possible that Martha is there, as the Orthodox tradition tells us. Mary, then, as we kind of move on to her, there seems to be the younger sister. Is sometimes she's referred to as being the apostle to the apostles. Again, at this stage, as I'm doing this, I'm assuming that we're working with this working hypothesis that Mary of Bethany is also Mary Magdalene, and that she's called Mary Magdalene because she is the tower. We looked at this last time. So I'm working on that. But Mary Magdalene is referred to the apostles because she is the first person, if you stop and think of it like this, she is the first person that the resurrected Jesus actually sends to do a job. And the word apostle means to be sent. So she is apostled. She is the first person to be apostled by Jesus after the resurrection. Jesus also meets the other women, of course, and they run on ahead. I can't remember as I'm talking now off the top of my head whether he specifically tells them to go on and talk to his disciples at that point. But if they are, then they would be in that. They would be apostles. They were before Jesus actually apostled his apostles after the resurrection. I feel like I'm being very clumsy with my language tonight, but hopefully you can follow what I'm saying. So in recognition of the importance of that kind of a role. So as I say, I've covered Mary, Bethany, and Mary Magdalene multiple times. So I won't spend too much time on Mary, but just kind of patching the pieces together of this kind of family that has such a significant role. And obviously Lazarus, as we've touched on as well, has a kind of very kind of key position, which comes out in John's Gospel, but has been ignored by the Synoptic Gospels up to now. And I've touched on this before, but for tonight it's just worth restating it. But the Orthodox tradition, which I think on this family is a very good. The Orthodox kind of, it just feels like it makes sense. I know that's not good and scientific, but nothing about it is kind of unreasonable. It all kind of balances. And they actually tell us that there is a plot to kill Lazarus from the early days after the martyrdom of Stephen. They don't tell us exactly how long it is after that period, but so after the martyrdom of Stephen, his life is under threat. And so according to tradition, he leaves Bethany, and actually Martha goes with him at that point. But Mary stays in Jerusalem for a while, but she rejoins them later. Eventually they go to Cyprus, where they then join and meet up with Paul and Barnabas, who make Lazarus the leader of the kind of the new church there. And just as kind of an interesting little thing, in 890 AD, a tomb was discovered with the inscription "Lazarus, a friend of Christ" on it. And then even interesting, I don't know if it's more interesting. It's only in 1970 there was a fire in the church, and in the renovation they actually uncovered a reliquary box as well, which seems to have his remains in it. They've not been, as far as I know, they went off to a monastery in Russian Orthodox Church, I think, because they were all, the church in Cyprus was Greek Orthodox. I don't know if they've ever been genetically tested, but so there's a kind of strong tradition of certainly Martha and Lazarus eventually ended up in Cyprus, and actually that whole thing of them becoming, if you like, part of the missionary movement makes sense of why then actually the church in Rome would have churches that related themselves back to Martha. Because in actual fact, the one of the things that's interesting that kind of corroborates this, if you like, this tradition, is that the church in Cyprus that actually maintained its own kind of independent status for a very, very long period of time. It was recognised in the early church, some of the councils and so on. It kind of had its own status as its own kind of sending church. So actually the fact that Martha was a part there of a sending church would then explain why there were churches in Rome who relate themselves back to her. So, slowly getting there. I'll probably get to the end of all this and then discover the recording hasn't worked or something, but maybe I shouldn't be so negative. It's just been one of those evenings. So we come then on to Joanna and Susanna, the other kind of the women, other of the myrrh bearers. Actually, we know very little about them other than that they are clearly key eyewitnesses in Luke's account, and countless bits of work have been done highlighting how they kind of fit into that. And one of the very obvious things is that actually if we didn't know about Joanna and her husband Chusa, then there are details in the Gospels, Matthew and Mark in particular. I've got quotes from the two of them there, which we wouldn't really know how come the early church knew them. They probably wouldn't cause a stumbling block to us. So I've got, at that time, Herod said to his servants, you see. So this is an intimate conversation. It's not a matter of history that can be kind of imported into the gospel. And Herod feared John and kept him safe, we read about in Mark. So where's that information come from? Is it just the opinion of Peter? or is it actually that we have information that's come back? And of course, just things like the knowledge of John the Baptist's death coming to Jesus as the 12 are going out, and so on. We need to have a kind of courtly connection into Herod's base to understand the eyewitness nature of all of those aspects of the gospel. So it's likely that that Chusa, I think, is also the royal official. I say likely to me, I have to be qualified here. It's likely to me that he's the royal official whose son gets healed in John 4:6. Although in Luke's gospel he also highlights, he kind of groups Joanna as women who've had been delivered of various demons. So whether they're two miracles or just one, but for whatever reason she becomes an active supporter. And for some reason, which I never quite understand, people get all kind of worked up as to whether she would be able to, if her husband was so close to Herod, surely he would be anti-Jesus, and could she, and so on. That doesn't seem to be realistic. There are plenty of folks who civil servants have to work for people they don't necessarily agree with, and countless generations have done that without compromising themselves. So it doesn't seem that big a deal. But there's not too much else we can probably say about them other than their kind of role. There's nothing we really get from the early church about their role. The only thing, I just said there's nothing we get. There is there is one kind of possible caveat to that issue, which is that although it's a view of modern scholarship, that certain modern scholars link Joanna to Junia, who is referred to is in Corinthians in Paul's writing, who's of note among the apostles, and so for instance Richard Balcom, who done a whole lot of work on the kind of the Gospel of John and so on, he raises that as a possibility. The only thing I'd say on that is that in that verse, she's paired with a guy called Andronicus. I mean, it kind of sounds almost like they're a husband and wife team, a bit like Priscilla and Aquila, you know. So to me, I kind of like the idea, but it doesn't quite, to me, fit the narrative, you know. I don't think she would be paired with another guy so closely there with no distinction, if you see what I mean. It sounds like they're a couple. So Junia in that case wouldn't be Joanna. But it would have been nice if that was the case. And I'm raising it for you. If you want to go and explore it for yourselves, you can go and look at that and think about that in its own way. And then finally, included in the group of the myrrh bearers, of course, is Nicodemus and Joseph. Because they do exactly what the title is. They get loads of myrrh and aloes and are involved in it. The women come back 3 days later, and often people said, oh, you know, why did they come and so on. Actually, I just saw a comment recently which I suddenly thought, oh, why did I have thought of that before? We just said actually in it's not just Jewish weddings, Jewish funerals, but actually in lots of cultures, lots of ancient cultures, mourning would go on for several days, and there would be constant tending to the body. So probably the women who go after the Sabbath, because they don't go on the Sabbath because they can't then, but they're actually just in the normal flow of the process of mourning and preparing and tending the body, and they've got extra spices in the process. So it's not that they don't think that the huge amount of spices that have been supplied by Nicodemus and Joseph are adequate. That's not the issue. It's just actually, you know, cultural expectation would be that they should just go on doing this for several days, and the number of days might vary depending on how significant and closely related they are to the person. So it's just probably part of that flow. But Nicodemus and obviously and Joseph, as we'll think about, are again considered to be part of this kind of core group. So there was a man of the Pharisees named Nicodemus, a ruler of the Jews. So Josephus refers to Jerusalem's leading elite as being the chief priests and the leading men of the Pharisees. So Nicodemus is one of the Pharisees, and he's a ruler of the Jews. And Gamaliel is the same. So Nicodemus is someone who's very like Gamaliel, who trained Paul. And actually, he kind of he presents a case where just a handful of the wealthiest lay people are considered part of the Sanhedrin. So the Sanhedrin is normally the kind of priestly caste, but they also have elders of kind of the wealthiest families who are considered elders of the people. So in that sense, we would just know the fact that he is part of that tells us he's very, very wealthy, and that fits what we know from the kind of the rabbinic histories as well. So he's a senior leader in the Pharisee movement. He's a member of the influential kind of Gurian family, which is the third richest in Jerusalem, which we get these things from the rabbinic writings now rather than the early church. He's remembered in the rabbinic writings as being a disciple of Jesus. These are all kind of summary statements. We'll have a quick look at them in a second. And of course he provides a lot of myrrh and aloes for Jesus' burial. So if we look at the name Nicodemus as it appears in the rabbinic writings, it kind of appears, there are two of them. They appear either side of the Nicodemus we're interested in. It's a Greek name, and it seems to enter Jewish circles with a military leader who's there in one of the kind of the push outs of the Hasmonean dynasty in terms of the way they're establishing the nation state of Israel. And so about 100 years before Jesus, there's one of those periods, which is what, of course, conquers Edom and brings the Edomites in as proselyte Jews, which of course then brings Herod's family into Judaism. So it's in that kind of period that we first encounter the name Nicodemus in that kind of Maccabean expansion. And so Josephus writes about him, which is why historically often people saw Nicodemus as a very, very old man, because he would be very old if he's been 100 years, about 100 years before Jesus, because they thought, oh, that must be the same Nicodemus. But as we're seeing, there's also a Nicodemus after Jesus, and actually is an unusual name, and unusual names are definitely maintained within the ruling families. That's one of the habits you can see. They like unusual names. It's a bit like if you meet kind of a Fitzpatrick or a Fitzwilliam or whatever, it means they came over with Norman the Conqueror, and they like unusual names, and they might call their son Tarquil or something, just because it's unusual and stands out. And things don't change, so unusual names are maintained in the ruling families. So so Nicodemus, we kind of therefore know his family, about the history of it. And so one of the things we kind of see is actually part of that family. It's the family that carries the name Ben Gurion, or Gurion, which of course is significant even into modern Jewish leadership today. So there's a guy called Gurion who's a father and a patron of Hillel, who's a very kind of famous Pharisee, a generation before Jesus, Pharisaic rabbi, and he hosted Pharisee leaders at a huge house in Jericho. So we then find the names Nicodemus and Gurion kind of in further down the line, and we kind of inferring all of those things, we would assume that there is a Nicodemus within Jesus's generation. But this one seems to actually be a Pharisee. He's not just hosting the Pharisees, he really is one. So this is the kind of the reconstructed family tree, which you've probably seen before. I put it in the manual, it's there, and so on. So we kind of these are the ones we know about in red. The two Nicodemuses there, and that generation where Gurion is, where we might assume there should be another Nicodemus. But one of the things and I've touched on this, is we know about naming conventions, and you probably heard me say that before, so I don't want to spend too long on it because we're already taking time tonight, taking longer with that half-hour messing around trying to get things working. As I say, we know that the names are kind of kept within the family. But what's interesting is in the rabbinic writings as well, and we actually find a kind of reference to what looks like a Nicodemus in a kind of a little polemic that is written, a kind of in which 5 of Jesus's disciples are put on trial. They're actually called Jeshu rather than Yeshua. It's a kind of but actually that title is used for scorn of a rabbi that is disliked, and almost universally people recognise that it's a reference to Jesus, and it's thought that perhaps it's a kind of a clumsy kind of insult, in the sense that perhaps the Galilean accent kind of slurs the vowels together, so he just becomes Yeshu. Yeshu rather than Yeshua. But he's listed as having 5 disciples who are all kind of put on trial for being, and it's a kind of it's not a real story, it's a kind of it's a teaching piece, and each of them is given a kind of shortened nickname of their real name, and their shortened nickname captures, if you like, the root word, which is part of every Jewish name, is made up of a real word. And their sentence is always in some way or other related to what their name is. So I can't remember what all of the meanings are. I should look it up and put it on the slide at some point, I guess. But there's a Mattai, who's clearly Matthias or Matthew.
And then there's an Anaki, which is the Nicodemus, you see, short for Nicodemus. There's a Neser, which apparently relates to Nathaniel. It's a kind of a shortened version through Nittai. It's the way you kind of go through multiple generations of producing a nickname. And then Buni, which is one that's not so well known, although interestingly, it's been highlighted there are Ben-Anias in the Nicodemus family. But having two from the same family makes sense to me. I think about the fact that Beni is part of what we think of as Bernarges, which of course is given to the Romans. So it may be that somehow Mark hasn't kind of captured the etymology, but sons of thunder. The Beni is the sons bit. So Buni might be Beni, if you like, because actually Aramaic and Hebrew doesn't have the mark exactly which vowel it is at this point. So it may have come to us as Buni, could have been Beni, and it may have been part of the nickname of either James or John, just as a thought. And then Todai, which is short for Thaddeus. So we've got these five who are recognised by the rabbis, and Nicodemus is one of them. So we have kind of, if you like, separate kind of testimony to him. So yes, as I say, I would, putting it together, we recognise it's probably there's a brother or a cousin of who's a rabbi of Gurion, who we know about, sometimes called Guria, who's a wealthy patron of the Pharisees. So he's part of this very wealthy family. And then interestingly, we've got this little Joseph hanging over on the corner, who to me is a good fit for Joseph of Arimathea. We see the two of them working together. And they both are very supportive of Jesus in their different ways. So because there are only kind of just over 70 members of the Sanhedrin, it can vary a little bit because but it's around 72 most of the time. And so the fact that Joseph is also a part of the Sanhedrin, there aren't huge numbers of Pharisaic families in the Sanhedrin, and the fact that we know that actually at roughly around the same period, there is a Joseph within the family. I like to think that makes sense. And as I've touched on before, of course, that there's also a possibility that Joseph of Arimathea is the rich young ruler that meets Jesus, which he would be young because actually he's the generation underneath Nicodemus. So if he's part of the Sanhedrin at this age, he would be a young ruler from a very wealthy family. Which kind of brings us to our last of our myrrh bearers, which is Joseph, who we know is wealthy. He's a respected member of the Sanhedrin, is possibly, as I say, the rich young ruler. He's also a Pharisee based in Judea, and of course he's the one that takes charge of burying Jesus' body. He generates a huge sum, a huge amount of legendary traditions about him, which are very difficult to kind of take as history. Did those feet in ancient times. That's all about Joseph actually being Jesus' uncle, which there's no evidence for. It's just in Jesus' uncle and brings Jesus to Cornwall. Those kind of things are great. They're great kind of for kind of, if you're supporting England in football, those kind of things did those feet in ancient times, but they're not real history. But he generates that because he's he is an important figure again. He's there as a witness. Let's say possibly that relative of Nicodemus, and I'm hoping I've got a slide. Yeah, that's right. Of course, he and very importantly, which I think is seen a lot, particularly by Jewish people, they see the significance of it. Of course, he is involved in fulfilling the prophecy from Isaiah, which we think about. He was assigned a grave with the wicked. In other words, he's supposed to be just as Jesus. He's supposed to be thrown into a common grave with other common criminals, and with the rich in death. So suddenly this contrast. He's supposed to have a grave with the wicked, but because the word "and" there could also be "but" in Isaiah, but was with the rich in his death, because actually he's put in Joseph's tomb. Though he'd done no violence, nor was there any deceit in his mouth. And I'm pretty sure, because I was putting these slides in quickly earlier today, it was my last slide. So we did get through tonight, and once I moved downstairs, we stopped breaking up, which was good news. Does anyone want to ask anything or kind of put some comments in? So I talk at my computer with no kind of real feedback as to whether people are falling asleep or so if you want to tell me anything, that would be really helpful.
Well, it certainly gives a lot of background information.
Yeah, yeah,
You know, I must admit that the manual helps with the family trees. I found that really helpful.
yeah, yeah,
And then being able to kind of slot them together with the, you know, the various temple connections and
yeah.
other aspects of it. So it's been very useful for you to actually pull it together, to
Yeah.
make some notes really and draw them out.
Yeah, well, and hopefully, as I said, you know, in many ways, part of being able to do this with this group is in a kind of smaller ways. You can kind of raise things that are ambiguous, which sometimes it's harder to do when you're talking to a whole big group. So that's why in one sense, you have to kind of settle a bit more, which is not conning anybody. It's saying this is where 90% of the time I find myself settled, but I'm also aware of these other possibilities, and in my own thinking, those other possibilities are always key, because that's how things might develop. You know, you might be settled here 90% of the time now, but in 10 years' time, you discover something new, and it makes you think, okay, let's just move this a bit this way. So that's why I wanted to do. Yeah, I wanted to kind of get across some of these kind of traditions and so on.
Yeah, it's very helpful when you bring out the early church writing, because otherwise these people just seem to disappear, don't they?
They do,
never
don't they?
get
Yeah, I
they
know.
become, you know, just parts of the story, but you never really know what happened to them. Where it's good to see that a lot of the disciples ended up in other countries,
Yeah.
nations,
Well,
planting the church, which we now.
that's right. And the funny thing is, it's really interesting, because I can remember as a kid, probably even before I really made my own conscious decision to follow Jesus. But obviously, I used to travel around with my dad, and he'd be teaching, and I would always have these questions. I always wanted to know about what happened to people. I think it is something about a child's kind of fascination. You know, it's like, you know, if you read a story to a child, they want to know who some side character is. It's like, it's not good enough that they're just the bus, you know, the bus conductor. It's like, what's his name? What's his, you know, all of those kind of things. You have that kind of desire, and so in a funny way, doing the things like this now is just a kind of like my adult expression of that same. I would like to know. These must have been real people. Something must have really happened to them. And if nobody knows, then do I really believe the gospel, if I can put it that way, putting it rather bluntly? In other words, if they weren't real people, then, or if we don't know anything about them, then it feels like they weren't real people. So I want to know something about them. Now, I totally get it that there's as you get further and further away from the events, you get legendary bits come in. So tonight I haven't touched on things that only exist once you get to kind of medieval church or even later, you know. So there are traditions from there which might be older, but on the whole, by the time if we can't find them in the writings before then, that's the point where they've been made up totally. So.
But I think I mean, for me, it's useful because like Martha always seems to get a bit of a bad press.
Yeah.
But actually, she comes good in the end, doesn't she?
She does, and I think it's personally I find it that fascinating. I know you can't be 100%, but the fact that the church there in Larnaca was recognised as a kind of a missions-based church by the early church, and that she's traditionally put there, and with Lazarus, and the fact that there is a group in Rome that is recognised by a critic in the 2nd century as rooting back to Martha as its kind of patron. You know, those kind of things kind of I think are fascinating. You know.
Yeah.
It's not going to change my faith or not particularly, but it kind of makes me interested in the people I'll meet in eternity.
Yeah, and the impact that Jesus obviously had on her.
Yeah, very good. Well, thank you so much, guys, for sticking with it through all the headaches at the beginning. And I think I'll be doing what Derek said, which is going and getting myself a hardwired, which I did do down at the summer house, but it's just I keep moving around where I'm doing this. It'd be really nice one day to be all set up with lights and everything, just to be able to push the button and get everything turned on and go. But anyway, okay.
Okay.
Thanks for being with me tonight then, guys.
Great, thanks,
Thanks, Kristen.
See you.
Excellent. Thanks a lot.
See you.